Check. This thing? There's a lot of people in that thing too.
Really?
There's no plastic.
Wow. People I schedule. Dude, look at this. Physics 4 days a week, out 4 days a week, physics lab, communication, mechanical engineering stuff. I have Fridays off, but Monday through Thursday it's civil industry and how it's built or how it's stabilized.
So good afternoon, everyone. As you're taking your seats, I'm going to go ahead and get started.
This
Selection Committee and the UMKC libraries. They will host a panel discussion of Dr. Kim Nielsen's book, A Disability History of the United States, on October 25th. So make sure you thank you very much to all of our community partners. I'd like to also extend a special welcome to Dr. Kim Nielsen, keynote speaker for this evening. It is a pleasure to have her here at UMKC. I now invite Dr. Matthew Edwards. He's an associate professor and the chairperson of the Disability Alliance Affinity Group. He will introduce tonight's guest speaker.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. And thank you for coming tonight. My name is Matthew Edwards. I'm an associate professor of Spanish. I have to think about that sometimes. And associate faculty member of race, ethnicity, and gender studies. I'm also disabled. I am blind, and I think it's over time, I have found that self-identification is important both to myself and to others. For me, it has become a declaration that speaks against the silence that once defined my own approach to disability and the discrimination that plagues many of our social interactions. And although it can be confusing to some, what does blind mean? You can. What do you see? These are discussions that we have to have. They are important to helping us understand the difference of us, to understand meaning is created through our different experiences. By saying that I am disabled, by speaking out, by telling my story and listening to yours, allow for others to see how we move and feel and how our paths cross, coincide with and diverge from the paths of other people, other communities, and of other experiences. Tonight we gather around disability, and this is so special, I think. Its story, its history brings us together as it intersects with our own paths. And as we gather, let us prepare a little bit. Let us put our telephones on silence, okay? And please note that following the discussion today, we will host a brief Q&A session with Dr. Nielsen. And at your seat, you will notice that there is a note card and pencil. Please write your questions, if you have them, on the card, and during our Q&A session, a team member will collect it for you. Please keep your questions brief so that each guest may have an opportunity to ask theirs. At 7 p.m., we will start a book sale and signing by forming a line in the lobby outside this theater, where the books will also be available for purchase. Please keep in mind, we want everybody to have the opportunity to receive a signature before we conclude tonight's gathering promptly at 7:45. So we will be gently ensuring the flow of the book line is moving quickly. Okay? So now that all this housekeeping is done with, and that we are gathered here today in the name of disability, let us give a welcome to a national thought leader that will challenge the way we might think about ability and ableism. Dr. Kim Nielsen is a distinguished university professor of disability studies at the University of Toledo. There she teaches courses on disability history, gender, eugenics, and law. Nielsen is the author of widely used a disability history of the United States, multiple other books and articles, and co-editor of the award-winning Oxford Handbook of Disability History. Her most recent book, Money, Marriage, and Madness, The Life of Anne Auth, analyzes a mid-19th century physician incarcerated for 2 decades at a Wisconsin insane asylum. In addition, Dr. Nielsen has received 2 Fulbright appointments, numerous scholarly prizes, and the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. She received her PhD at the University of Iowa and today speaks widely on disability history and disability justice. It is a tremendous honor for me to welcome Dr. Kim Nielsen. Her work gathers us today around disability, to learn, to share, to grow. Please join me in giving a very warm Kansas City and UMPC welcome to Dr. Kim Nielsen.
Hello, Kansas City.
Whoa.
Thank you, Dr. Paul, and Dr. Edwards for that great introduction. See, I came back. I'm delighted to be here. I had a great pleasure meeting some of you this afternoon. Just a little bit of a check-in. I'm assuming you're about halfway done with your semester. You know, on a scale of like 1 to 5, 1 being you are happiest can be, living the stressed out. Where are you right now?
2.
Okay, looks like we're on the upper edge here. Okay, well, hopefully tonight what I will do is give you a little bit of reading space. I look forward to your responses and questions. My plan for today, if I can get my water going, is threefold. Through stories, I'm going to introduce you to disability history. Disability is pervasive throughout US history, but the extent to which it has been normalized, to which it has been acknowledged, varies tremendously. I'd also like to talk about why disability knowledge and analyses matter at this very particular moment in time in 2022. Disability has always been present everywhere, but this is a moment, I think, where disability is up in front and center. I want to lay this out. And then lastly, I'd like us to think about the gains, the lessons, the gifts that come from disability, and think about how disability activism and disability justice can provide us a path forward as individuals, and as community members, and as institutions. I also want to just start by saying that, I don't know, sitting sometimes is hard, isn't it? I assume some of you are at the end of the day, all those kinds of things. If you've got the wiggles, I am not at all offended. If you want to pace around in the back, need to stand by the side. I'm someone who knits through meetings, so I behave better. And so if you need to do whatever you need to do to cope with your wiggles, I am completely fine with that. So let's talk about disability history. Disability is simply part of being human. Human bodies, our ways of being, our ways of thinking, moving, and communicating have always varied tremendously. It has always been a standard part of the human experience. But as I said, in varying ways, it has often been unacknowledged, it has often been stigmatized. Now, I'm a historian. Any of you history majors out there? Ooh, okay, good. I think that when historians are honest, what being a historian means is that I love stories. Historians, I believe, are blends of two things. We are professional gossips, and we are professional detectives. And you can actually major in it. So I'm going to tell stories. The first story is a story about me, or perhaps about Helen Keller, and how I became interested in disability as a subject, as a tool of analysis, as a question of justice. I'm trained as a historian of US women in politics. And once upon a time, when I was a student, I was trying to work on my dissertation, or at least I should have been working on my dissertation. I sat in my university library procrastinating. And this is where all the students are supposed to gasp in horror and shock, okay? You got this? Yes, good.
I procrastinated. Now, my dissertation topic doesn't even matter here, but it involved me reading materials from the far right wing of the teens and 20s. And far right wing organizations of the time loved to make lists of the dire dangers that they believed the US faced. And in this case, they produced annual lists of the 10 most dangerous women in America. And the list always included anarchist Emma Goldman. It sometimes included Jane Addams, the social worker and peace and social justice activist. And sometimes, drum roll, it included Helen Keller. Now, I knew nothing about Helen Keller at that point in time. All I knew of her was that she was a deaf and blind kid from back in the day about whom really sappy movies were made. Sweet and inspirational enough to really annoy me. But procrastination nearly always wins in my life, and I ended up digging around in the library, and there was, as my dad says, there was no the Google back then. Helen Keller, I found, was a graduate of Radcliffe College, the female counterpart of Harvard. She could read and write in French, German, Greek, Latin, as well as English. Think about that as a college student. How many of you are fluent in 5 languages? I am definitely not. Her first book, The Story of My Life, published in 1904, began as a college essay. It went on to become, and it still continues to be, one of the world's bestsellers. She spent the next 20 years reading and writing and lecturing. She was a founding member of the ACLU, a founding member of the NAACP. She embraced female voting rights, critiqued economic disparities, spoke out against militarism, and she supported striking workers. In 1924, she was hired by the American Foundation for the Blind to do publicity, to do fundraising, and political lobbying on behalf of disabled people across the globe. And she became a State Department ambassador, a favorite, a much relied on ambassador during the Cold War period. She died in 1968 and is buried at the National Cathedral as a hero. Her political and intellectual life had been largely erased from American public memory. And this is what really caught me, and I'll read this through. In 1924, when she would have been in her early 40s, Keller wrote to Robert La Follette, who was a Wisconsin senator running for president at that time. He had asked her for a public statement of support. No, she said regretfully. These are her words. I have hesitated to write to you because I know that the newspapers opposed to the progressive movement will cry out at what they call the pathetic exploitation of deafblind Helen Keller by the motley elements who support La Follette. She went on, it would be stupid and difficult to imagine anything more than the attitude of the press toward anything I say on public affairs. So long as I confine my activities to social service and the blind, they compliment me extravagantly, calling me archpriestess of the blind, Wonder Woman, and a modern miracle. But when it comes to a discussion of poverty, she wrote, and I maintain that it is the result of wrong economics, that the industrial system in which we live is much at the root of the physical deafness and blindness in the world, that's a different matter. I do not mind having my ideas attacked and my aims proposed and ridiculed, she went on, but it is not fair fighting or good argument to find that Helen Keller's mistakes spring out of the limitation of her development. Keller determined really sadly that she was going to leave public engagement with politics because her involvement did harm to the causes she loved. Think about that. The assumption that disability equated political incompetency effectively silenced her, while her disability did not. It is attitudes, not disability, that caused the problem. Political opponents used ableist assumptions, disability stigma, to effectively accuse the causes she believed in of manipulating poor disabled Helen Keller. They believed her incapable of developing her own political thoughts. Imagine how infuriating that must have been. My example of Keller illustrates a couple things, but I think one, the lived experience of disability, but also two, the ideologies regarding disability and its place in power structures. Keller's story fascinated me, and I went down this long rabbit hole, which I continue to abide in which I wonder about the role that disability played throughout US history in shaping our politics, our ideas, your daily lives, the lives of all of us. I argue that bringing disability into our analytical toolbox has incredible potential to help us better understand history, power, justice, culture, and ourselves. The dominant method of defining disability assumes disability to be a medical problem with a cure that has to be fixed. It erroneously presumes disability to be ahistorical. But of course it's not. Similar to race, class, gender, sexuality, disability is historically and culturally ever changing. Which bodily, which mental variabilities are considered inconsequential, which are considered charming and which are stigmatized, changes over time, and that is the history of disability. Defining disability is really difficult, and that's part of my argument. Although disability theoretically has been based on bodies, the categorization of bodies as disabled has always been entwined with other power hierarchies. Race, gender, class, sexuality, education, the level of privacy that you have access to adaptive equipment, age, and class. With age and medical care, as well as simply the varieties of life, we can move in and out of the category of disability. Some of us can be temporarily disabled due to accident or illness. Disabilities can be easily read by others, such as the sign of the presence of a wheelchair or the sound of a speech impediment. But oftentimes, disability is not apparent, and it is difficult to discern, such as some psychological disabilities, neurological disabilities, and variable disabilities. Now, I don't want to argue that we should simply all hold hands, sing songs, cheerfully insist that we're all disabled in some way or another. That's not effective. That ignores the very lived reality that sometimes disability brings physical discomfort or difficulty. That ignores the historical reality that being disabled has made access to power very difficult, access to resources difficult. It ignores the reality that hierarchies of power contribute to definitions of disability. Today, people with disabilities live disproportionately in poverty and have disproportionately lower rates of higher education in the United States. We know that the feminization, the racialization of poverty is not just natural and unavoidable. Neither are the poverty rates of people with disabilities. These are the results of specific social structures, specific histories, specific legal practices, industrialization, educational access, tax structures, and the more. But disability, thus, is at the center of our US history. It is fundamental to our national story, and it's omnipresent. I'd like to start with a big example, and then we'll go to some small ones. My first example is of industrialization. Big topic. Disability and able-bodiedness are inseparable from the historical development of industrialization and capitalism. Industrialization, though it increased in uneven fits and starts, has sometimes made it more difficult for people with disabilities and impairments to earn a living. Now, prior to industrialization, a young woman unable to walk had easily worked, and we know of many cases in which young women worked in their family's early 19th century shoemaking business. However, as shoemaking moved from homes where people did it as families to large factories, a person such as our young woman would have been kept out of labor. She would not be able to live in the inaccessible dormitories available to female workers. She would not be able to walk the distances demanded of her, nor would other factory workers, be willing and able, as her family members had, to bring food to her, to aid in emptying her chamber pot. Industrialization profoundly altered the economic value of her contributions to her household and redefined what disability meant for her and her family. Rather than an economic asset, she became an economic deficit. Industrialization has also caused disability. When President Benjamin Harrison issued his first address to Congress in 1899, he gave this big shout out to railroad workers who were subject, he said, to, quote, the peril of life and limb as great as that of a soldier during war. It's really hard to exaggerate the impact of mines, steel plants, farm labor, textile factories, lead poisoning, assembly lines, repetitive motion on the bodies of working class men, women, and children. Some of you, I assume, have parents who have been disabled by labor. Some of you may have been disabled by labor. When Crystal Eastman investigated early 20th century steel mills, she found a laborer who referred to a dinky. Anybody know what a dinky is? If you were my students, I'd give you a prize. A dinky was that 19th century small locomotive. A dinky had ran over the foot of one man and crushed it so badly that he had to lose his leg. His employer gave him $150 and a watchman's job, but had cut his earnings by 40%. His family's income was cut by 40%. This was routine. Eastman also found one mother who could not even remember how her just 16-year-old son had lost 2 fingers because it was so unremarkable in the laboring system. One retired steelworker told Eastman, "I never got hurt to speak of." She kept questioning him, and then he recalled that he had once fractured his skull, he had lost half a finger, and he was laid up for 9 weeks with a crushed foot. Yet he insisted that he had never got hurt much to speak of. These physical consequences were so common in early industrialization. Textile mill workers lost their fingers, hands, and arms. Female factory operatives were often vulnerable to horrific injuries to their scalps due to their hair being caught in various industries. Male and female cigar workers had their own injury title called cigar maker's neurosis, caused by repetitive motion. Clock and watch painters, most of them female, experienced the paralysis and mental debility caused by lead poisoning, as well as throat and mouth cancer. My point here is that we can't talk about industrialization without talking about disability. Disability is at the core of labor history, industrialization. It is what it meant to be a working class American in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's also at the core of all facets of history. But I want to insist that disability analysis alone are not enough to understand the world. We all live complicated lives, and we live in this world in which the lived experiences, the ideologies, the privileges, the power structures of disability, race, class, gender, they're all entwined. Revealing the tangles is difficult. We need overlapping and simultaneous analysis, and we need to do it, not just because, but we need to do it to better understand the world and to be better teachers, to be better tax accountants, to be better journalists, to be better NFL players who don't end up with brain damage, to be better musicians, parents, and voters. Now it's time for some specific historical examples. One of the most disturbing examples of the intersection, for example, of ableism and racism is the story of French ship Le Roudeur. And this was just one trip of thousands during the Atlantic slave trade. 15 days into this 1819 voyage across the Atlantic, the first symptoms of what they called ophthalmia appeared amongst those held in bondage. Crew members paid no attention. Cases of the disease and its resulting blindness spread quickly and were made worse by dysentery. Soon, many crew members also caught the disease and were blind. Eventually, 39 enslaved Africans failed to regain their eyesight. 26 others had diminished vision. 12 of the crew members had lost their eyesight. Any loss of sight amongst the enslaved would reduce the trader's profit. As a later government report stated, quote, even those blind of one eye would sell for a mere trifle. The captain thus had everybody brought to the deck. He had a crew member tie a piece of ballast, that is a weight, to the legs of 39 enslaved and now blinded individuals. What happened next? As a young crew member wrote in a letter to his mother, quote, the miserable wretches were then thrown into the sea. This story haunts me. The slave trade existed to make money. Disease, disability, or death resulted in a loss of profit. Following the very sick and perverse logic of slavery, and following the overwhelming ableist belief that blind people could not labor, the crew simply threw overboard those enslaved human beings who had lost vision. As with nearly all slave trading ships, the sharks followed in the wake. While clearly not all ocean voyages ended in large-scale blindness, the devaluing of human beings, and particularly the devaluing of enslaved Africans with disability, considered useless, was omnipresent in the slave trade. The captain of the Le Rôdeur could and did file an insurance claim for damaged cargo. Racism and ableism entwined horribly. Then we have the example of Samuel Cartwright. Cartwright, a white physician and leading proponent of slavery, argued that the bodies of African Americans were so disabled that slavery was a kindness. In 1848, he identified and began to diagnose diseases that he believed specific to the impaired and inferior bodies of enslaved people. The first one I'm going to use as an example is what he called drapetomania. And he said this was a disease, a pathological disease that caused the enslaved people to attempt escape. He diagnosed hebetude, a disease, he said, which caused enslaved people to be lazy, not work hard, and to damage property such as farm tools. Now, of course, this is ridiculous. Resisting slavery via escape, via the damage of property, via not working hard was very logical. It is a form of resistance. It is not evidence of a pathological body or mind. This is an example of a situation in which the concept of disability was used to justify slavery, racism, and brutality. My next example, and this is of Edward Clark, and this name may give this away to some of you. But in 1873, Edward Clark, a famed Harvard medical professor, issued a dire public health warning. And I suspect that the public of 1873 paid as much attention to public health warnings as the people of 2020. We'll go with that. But he argued that, he warned that there was something going on that should excite the gravest alarm and demand the serious attention of the country. An important group of people, he said, had been permanently disabled to a greater or lesser degree, or even fatally injured by these causes. So what was up? What were these causes? Middle and upper white class women were attending college. College, he said, would result in the permanent disabling or fatally injuring to women in higher education. Women going to college, he said, would study. Oh my gosh, do some of you study? Would study, the blood would go to their brain. As they read, it would leave their uterus and reproductive organs. They would become sterile. Your college education would make you sterile. It would render them insane, and for many of them, they would die. This, he said, was a public health crisis. Attributing disability lent legitimacy to women's exclusion. Ableism and sexism combined. Now, then there's the example of Charles Steinmetz, and I have to admit, I actually have a historical crush on this guy right now. He's long dead, so my sweetie has no problem. Charles Steinmetz sailed into the New York harbor in 1889. He had barely made it through immigration. Within 10 years of his U.S. arrival, however, he was an internationally recognized inventor, scientist, engineer, and researcher from General Electric, and well known amongst his friends for his meatloaf. His adopted hometown of Schenectady, New York, and if I say that wrong, I'm really sorry. This is a word beyond my capacity. Schenectady. He is remembered as the former president of the city council, the president of the Board of Education, and a Jewish philanthropist who bought orphans Christmas presents every year. In 1889, however, he was viewed disparagingly as this Jewish hunchback of short stature, 4'3". He was born to an educated family in German-speaking Poland, but spoke very little English when he arrived at the border and had no money. Immigration officials initially denied him entrance due to his disability, which was the standard policy of the time. A friend traveling with him protested loudly, proclaiming Steinmetz's intellectual brilliance, and lied that the money that the friend had was actually held by Steinmetz. There's also some historical hints that they bribed the immigration officials. but I'm sure nobody has ever done that in US history. Immigration officials then relented, and Steinmetz entered the country. Now, I want to emphasize that Steinmetz was the historical exception. Immigration officials could exclude him because he could be categorized as having what they called a poor physique. The Immigration Service defined individuals of poor physique as those who have a frail frame, flat chest, and are generally deficient in muscular development, or undersized, markedly of short stature, a dwarf. Immigration officials used the poor physique category to reject all kinds of folks at the immigration door. Individuals suspected of homosexuality or having bodies with ambiguous sexual organs. At various times, immigration officials could legally exclude anyone with epilepsy, those they called imbeciles or feeble-minded, the mentally ill or physically defective, the lunatic, idiot, or any person unable to take care of himself without becoming a public charge. The policy and practice was that anyone perceived to have a disability would never be able to make a living, despite evidence to the contrary. There are so many examples of this, but I always think of one example in 1913 of a 30-year-old blacksmith named Moshe Fishman, a deaf man, who arrived at the border and was deported back to Jewish pogroms. He was told he would never be able to find employment. He arrived in the US with 2 job offers in his pocket. He had family members who were willing to support him. And despite the 2 job offers in his pocket, he was told he would never get a job. He said, look, I've got 2 job offers. No, you'll never get a job. The ableism of this meant they could leave him outside the United States, and he was deported. So in this process of immigration, disability literally shaped the body, the American body. And the definition of disability was shaped by homophobia, by anti-Semitism, and classism. Then there's the story of Julia O'Brien. In 1942, O'Brien needed new car tires. She needed her car to get to her job as an English teacher at a local high school. She had held this job for 21 years. Due to the rubber rationing of World War II, she could not buy new tires. And what you see here is a gasoline ration card, but there were also very similar ones for tires, rubber rationing. Due to polio at the age of 5, O'Brien could not walk. After being sent back and forth between local and state appeal boards several times in her efforts to acquire new tires, O'Brien wrote to President FDR, President Roosevelt. She said, "You know what it means to have your wings clipped." She wanted his help. She feared that any day her tires would blow and she would lose her job if she did not get new tires. It infuriated her that throughout her entire appeals process, each of her requests would be denied repeatedly. That same year, a man named Mr. Bay Crockett of Pueblo, Colorado, also sought help from Franklin Roosevelt. Crockett, who had broken his back in 1918, used crutches, and he could not walk for more than a block. He had supported his wife and children as a traveling salesman and had done so for quite a while. His success, and he was very proud of this, required that he had a car. What would he do, he asked his president, when his work travel required more gas rationing coupons than he had? Like many others with mobility disabilities, he feared losing his job as an unexpected result of World War II's tire and gasoline rationing. O'Brien and Crockett got no assistance, and we don't know what happened to them. From the Revolutionary War onward, federal policy has generally assumed that people with disabilities and labor were contradictory terms, with the exception of labor organized through charities. Despite repeated realities to the contrary, ableist assumptions have driven policy. The final historical story I'm going to tell you is a story of sadness and a story of successful activism. It's a story that highlights the intersections between systems of oppression. In 1978, a young woman in St. Paul who lived in a neighborhood that I used to live in suffered rape in her apartment. She was a member of a local group called the United Handicapped Federation. She was a quadriplegic. She was active in the group that sought building accessibility and an end to employment discrimination. She gathered the wherewithal to try and bring good from this. She and other UHF members used the organization to fight back and assist other women, bringing the emerging feminist and disability rights movements together. They began with research, attempting just to learn more. Soon, other victims shared their stories, and members of the police told what they knew about the sexual assault of blind, mobility impaired, and cognitively disabled women. UHF members learned that rape support services were generally completely inaccessible. There were architectural barriers, inaccessible transportation, a lack of ASL interpreters, and few Braille resources. They soon developed a coalition of police, feminist activists, disability activists, county attorneys, and social workers, and they uncovered over 60 cases of sexual assault against local women with disabilities in just the previous 1 year period. Now, the barriers were not simply accessibility. There's also ableism and sexism. Many assault victims ran up against what activists called the ableist stereotypes that make it hard for the average person to accept the fact or even imagine that handicapped people are raped and beaten. An additional barrier was that in the 1970s Minnesota law, like so many other states, required that rape victims use, quote, legal force to resist their assault for any prosecution. Now, many reasons exist why a woman would not physically resist sexual assault. But for some disabled rape survivors, doing so was physically impossible. In such cases, even if the rapist was reported and caught, prosecutors ended up having to free the perpetrator. And that's what happened in this case. This young woman was quadriplegic and could not physically resist. When the sexual assault bill was finally changed in 1982, the UHF was recognized as both a sponsor and an impetus for the legislative amendment. Now, to me, one of the most disturbing historical symmetries in this story is the safety of public transportation for women. Public transportation has largely been inaccessible to those with mobility disabilities, but disabled women who could access public transportation experienced buses as places of sexual danger and assault. Just as we know, buses were places of sexual assault and danger for African American women in places such as Montgomery, Alabama, and across the United States. The campaign for public transportation was not only one of access, but it's one for safety. Today, violence continues to be an issue for people with disabilities and those who love them. We know that violence is one of the largest creators of disability. War, community, and familial violence are the largest creator of disability historically. For every child killed in warfare, there are 3 who are disabled. Continuing today, the sexual assault rates of people with disabilities are significantly higher than those without. It's estimated that the sexual assault rate of people with disabilities is twice that of the non-disabled population. And amongst developmentally disabled adults, it is as much as 83% higher for women, it's estimated that as many as 83% of women with developmental disabilities and 32% of men with developmental disabilities are victims of sexual assault. This continues to be an issue. What you see here is that, I'm going to stay there, sorry. These are stories of disability, but they're also stories of race, of class, of gender, sexuality. They're stories of our historical realities that are central to understanding our past. I've told them to illustrate how important it is to undertake complex and multifaceted analyses. Now I'm going to go just a step further and think about democracy and disability. Now, we're at this moment where we're thinking a lot about democracy in the United States. The story of US history, at least as I was taught it as a kid, and as I see it often on TV, is the story of independence, rugged individualism, autonomy, and self-made men, maybe a few women, who with hard work and determination can move and have moved from rags to riches. Just as the colonists sought and gained independence from Great Britain in order to create this powerful country, so must individual peoples seek and gain independence to create successful and powerful selves. We have the US democracy that's founded on the very notion that we can trust each other to vote, that voters are capable, and voters can be given this great responsibility to determine leadership. As citizens, we're told to stand on our own 2 feet, speak up for ourselves, ableist phrases if ever there was. But this is a version of our national story in which independence is good and dependence is bad. It's a story in which dependency means inequality, weakness, and reliance on others. Now, this is really messy. But I think that when dependency means inequality, weakness, and reliance on others, and when disability is equated with dependency, disability becomes stigmatized. Citizens with disabilities are simply stigmatized as inferior citizens. When disability is understood as dependency, disability is stood in direct contrast to the ideals of American independence. Now, in real life, however, just as in a real democracy, all of us are dependent on others. All of us contribute to and benefit from the care of others. As taxpayers, as recipients of public education, which all of you are at this moment, I sloughed off and relied entirely on the state for my free K-12 education. Lots of us have. As the children of parents, we are dependent. As those who use public roads, transportation, we are dependent. As beneficiaries of publicly funded medical research. Now, even some of us have not participated in wage work during various life stages. How many of you have sloughed off your parents for at least the first 10 years of your life? Come on, I know you were not contributing to the family household. We're an interdependent people. Dependency is not bad. In fact, I will insist it's at the heart of what being human means. And it's at the heart of our national experience. It's what makes us a community and a democracy. I think that the use of disability as an analytical tool matters because it forces analysis of these strengths, weaknesses, and contradictions of the American ideals. The story of US history is one of many efforts to define, care for, contest, and enshrine a very specific national body, a national body good for the nation. Now let me move a little bit and talk about why disability, I think, matters at this very moment in 2022. I want to lay this out. We're at a unique moment as a nation and a global community, a unique moment in which disability is central, even while often unacknowledged. Now, I'm going to be a little discouraging here, I'm sorry, but hopefully I'll create a space in which we can explore some optimism and how the lived experience of disability can generate paths out of despair. Living through the global pandemic of COVID-19 has changed us, and the pandemic is not done. In the United States alone, over 1 million people have died of COVID. My brother died of COVID. He had 2 high school age kids. This is a data point, this million person number, which nearly all experts say is underestimated. Extrapolate that outwards to imagine the number of US residents mourning those 1 million people who have died and the trauma with which those mourners wrestle. Some of you are in that category. This year, COVID is on track to kill at least another 100,000 people. Scientists estimate that 20% of adult COVID survivors in the US have developed long COVID, with consequences familial, economic, professional, relational, and daily life. In other words, 19 million people, and some scholars estimate this up to 23 million, 19 million people have entered the world of disability in the last 2 years, perhaps for a short time, perhaps for a long time. We just don't know. And these numbers of people have become disabled in the very small time span of just over 2 years. These are disabilities related to heart, related to their lungs, neurological, psychiatric, sensory, and brain damage. Brain fog is brain damage, and more stuff that we're just figuring out. This will impact education, it will impact your employment, it will impact healthcare, families, and the people that we love. In addition, the pandemic has exacerbated the already bad unemployment numbers for people with disabilities. We know that residents of congregate care facilities caught the virus and died at very high numbers. We know that shutdowns resulted in many children with disabilities being cut off from in-person special education services. All of this is going to have long-term consequences about which we can only begin to guess. In addition, the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the targeted murders of Black folks at a Buffalo grocery store less than a year ago, amongst so many other realities and daily experiences, spotlight the continuing and horrific realities of racism in the United States. As a nation, as a national community, we are living with, but we are not wrestling with, the physically, emotionally, and psychologically disabling aspects of racism. Even while even while COVID has made very stark the racial disparities in US medicine and their sometimes daily consequences. And finally, though my list could be longer, every time I open a national publication, every time I open Facebook, which I really have to stop, every time I think about my students, the contents forcibly remind me that we as a nation are entrenched in a mental health crisis. At the same time, psychiatric care is sometimes difficult to access. An ableist stigma about mental illness flourishes. A personal example that makes me sigh every time, and all of you remotely are not supposed to tell my parents, okay? Are you guys okay with that? No telling on me to my parents. 6 months into the shutdown, my father updated extended family members over email about himself and my mother. I'm glad they were okay. But he ended with a joke, or what he thought was a joke, reassuring us that they were fine and did not yet need counseling. I knew of at least 3 members on that email list who were in counseling, one who had previously spent a month in a psych ward, and 2 others who needed counseling, were seeking counseling, but could not find it because of the lack of psychological support services in rural Iowa. This is our contradiction and our crisis. We are at this national moment, and perhaps a global moment, in which disability justice and activism are flourishing, and while ableism and disregard for people with disabilities is also flourishing. It's a moment of contradiction. So speaking only for myself, I am bone weary, I am grieving, I am scared, I am angry. I'm someone different than I was 30 months ago. I'm someone different than I was in 2016. Sometimes I find it difficult to claim the headspace, to fight back the clutter and the anxieties, or alternatively, to embrace my clutter and anxieties in order to imagine anew. At this moment, weary and terrified as we are, many of us ache to imagine and then to live a changed world. So now that I've depressed you all, I want to move on to disability justice and access and think about the lessons that disability teaches us, the gains. We need disability justice and activism. I yearn for disability justice and activism. Now, I'm going to make a claim, and this perhaps sounds benign, but I think it's radical. Disability is not the end of the world. In fact, it can be quite fine. Indeed, letting go of ableism will make life easier for all of us. And I'm going to start small and give you a couple examples of how comfort with disability has made life easier. First, all of the social psychology research on disability indicates that people with disabilities have the same life satisfaction levels as those who are not disabled. The exception is the first year of disability adjustment for people who acquire new disabilities. But I want to go beyond that. This is not a world-changing example, but it was a world-changing example for me. I hate to fly, and I know that lots of people say this, but I really hate to fly. A while back, when my career was starting, I found myself curtailing career and professional opportunities, saying no to speaking invitations because I did not want to get on an airplane. My fear of flying caused me to harm my career. As I began to think more deeply about the absurdity of ableism, as I became more comfortable and honest about my own capacities, my own incapacities, I realized that I was being ridiculous. The ridiculousness, however, was not my fear of flying. I insist, actually, that's quite logical. But the ridiculousness was my inability to ask for help. I had to get over my own internalized ableism. So what did I do? Two things. First, I went to my doctor, and she gave me Xanax to get on airplanes. And this has been great. I believe it's Xanax before airplane flights. But secondly, and this has been more life transformative and more helpful than Xanax, actually, I ask for help from strangers. When I get on a plane now, I introduce myself briefly to the people sitting next to me and let them know that I really hate flying. I tell them I would really appreciate it if they would talk to me during takeoff and landing. And then I tell them I'm happy for them to ignore me the rest of the time. In fact, I actually would prefer them ignoring me. Now, no one has ever said no. Every single person has responded kindly. And I have had the most interesting, lovely conversations with people and with categories of people who are not my accustomed conversational partners. And some of these conversations have been really meaningful. And I think what it is that I say, look, I'm vulnerable. I need help. And I'm not asking a lot from you. And people respond to that with their own vulnerabilities, their own requests for help in one way or another. And they tell me their life stories. And it has been unexpectedly marvelous. I learned that everyone, like everyone, disability is everywhere in my life, my family's, my professional life, my neighborhood, my schools, the questions on which I'm voting. I also realized that, like so many people, ableism has a strong hold on myself and my extended family. When an elderly woman I love, actually, wait, in reality, who I then thought was elderly, but she's probably just as old as I am now, so she was really young. When she developed macular degeneration, I suggested mobility training, which is commonly used for those with vision loss. No, she said, I'm not disabled. I'm just growing old. She lived another 29 years, and her refusal to claim a blind identity harmed her well-being. This refusal meant significantly decreased mobility. It meant the loss of hobbies she loved and that she could have continued had she sought adaptive equipment. It meant a diminished engagement with people she loved. Ableism simply harms our lives. I had been in disability activist and community circles for almost 10 years when my then 16-year-old daughter became a disabled young woman overnight due to a rare and unexpected neurological disease. And that's a very tidy sentence about a very traumatic 2-year period. The trauma, however, came from family members, medical personnel, and a variety of community members. The trauma came from the ableist low expectations of others. And a large number of people apparently felt it appropriate to say, what's a pretty girl like you doing in a wheelchair? Some people assumed this young woman would give up her dreams of a prestigious university and instead live at home with her mom and dad forever and ever and ever. Some people praised a young man for his kindness and openness for inviting her to the prom. I thought he was damn lucky she accepted him. The morning of December 23rd at the grocery store, we had someone say, it's so nice to see people like you out in the world, and then pat her on the head. Think about that, pat her on the head. I want to read something I wrote a few years ago, which is in the intro to A Disability History of the United States. And just by the way, I give my kid, who's now an adult, veto power over any mention of her, even obliquely, so I feel strongly about that. And as I said, I started this book before our experience, and then Ed had to end it several years later. This is a different book than the one I started, for I'm a different person, and I live in a different family than that existed several years ago. Making my daughter laugh until she tips and falls over is really, really funny. Her core body muscles are so weak that strong laughter makes her fall over. We discovered this when my husband, Nathan, did it first. As my youngest daughter prepared to be Mary in the church Christmas program, my husband tried to convince her to yell, "My God, it's a girl!" at that pivotal moment. My newly disabled daughter laughed so hard that she fell on the kitchen floor and couldn't get up. The wonderful, delightful, confusing, and frustrating paradox of disability is that I am also the same person, and I live in the very same family that existed several years ago. My point here is that life went on, or as memoirist George Estroke wrote in The Shape of the Eye, and if any of you are looking for something to read, this is a really beautiful book about his family's experience with a disabled child. He said, It was as if they'd been expecting a trip to Italy, but somehow landed in Holland. New ways of being were invented, and those new ways of being were fine. They were just different. As activist Stacey Park Milburn had said, there is no reason for us to feel shame for who we are. We were born into this world exactly who as we are or what we became. We are who we were meant to be. What does a world without ableism look like? What would a world be of comfort and ease with disability? A few things. One, I believe that in such a world, we recognize that independence is a myth. Dependency is not a shameful position only held by those with disabilities. All of us are dependent on others, and the pandemic has highlighted this. Despite the US adoration of independence, the reality is that dependence is the norm and a desired state. Our levels of dependency and on whom we're dependent simply fluctuate throughout our lifetimes and the state of the world. I also believe that if we're comfortable with disability and then dependence, we can ask for help. All of us need help of various kinds throughout our lives, as individuals, as communities, and knowing when and how to ask for help is a really good thing. In fact, that's what mature human beings do. This is part of growing up. Acknowledging that we all need help, asking for help, knowing that it's not shameful, helps us dismantle the myth of independence. I talk with college students at my own institution about this. So students, you're supposed to listen, particularly here. Nationally, only 20 to 25% of college students with disabilities request the accommodations for which they are legally entitled. This is a legal right. And for every year in college that a student delays asking for their legal entitlements, their length of time to graduation increases by almost half a year. Those who delay asking for accommodations for longer than a year have a 3.5 times higher risk of not graduating than the general student population. Students with psychological disabilities have the longest delay rate of disclosure and are most likely to never disclose disability. This impacts their futures. This means we lose these students within a university. This shuts down their professional futures, their economic futures, their familial futures. It is okay for us to get rid of our own internalized ableism, to ask for help, and to seek these accommodations, which are a legal entitlement. Every year, I lecture families and students, basically to get over themselves, right, and ask for help. Additionally, I think acknowledging dependency, asking for help, we become more honest about our own capacities. None of us can do everything. Realizing that, living with that, breathing into that, can lift substantial weight from our shoulders and from our hearts. I'm going to end with what I hope is joyfully subversive. Not only is disability just not that bad, it is, as Mia Mingus has written, valuable. There's value in disabled people's experiences. And I'm going to talk about disability gain, and I am always afraid to do this because I don't want to veer into inspirational speaker territory. That is not my plan. And I believe that people with disabilities are not here to inspire. But as Mia Mingus has said, there is value in disabled people's experiences. I think of Rebecca Coakley, who worked in the Obama administration, is now a huge policy wonk across the nation in various think tanks, who is a woman with dwarfism. She wrote, "I am who I am because I have dwarfism. It is a rich culture. It has allowed me to understand discrimination, isolation, and society's lowered expectations." In other words, it has enabled her to become the policy wonk that she is and to strategize new opportunities. The good that comes from impairment would not be there if disability is excluded or edited out. My favorite example is Dorothea Lange. Some of you may be familiar with her work. She is now attributed as one of the best photographers throughout US history. She was hired during the US Depression as part of the WPA employment program and took a lot of the photographs that remain pivotal to our understanding of US history. This one here, the immigrant woman with her children, is one of her most famous. Dorothea Lange wrote, "I was physically disabled, and no one who hasn't lived the life of a semi-cripple knows how much that means. I think it perhaps was the most important thing that happened to me and formed me, guided me, instructed me, helped me, and humiliated me. For her, right, disability, the lived experience of disability made her a better photographer. One of the most, for me right now, valuable insights of disability activists is their emphasis upon access. And I'd like us to think beyond access laws. I'm all for obeying federal access laws, but that's not my reference point. I've come to think of disability justice as an expression of radical hospitality, a revolutionary welcome that goes beyond legal compliance. Mia Mingus, who I referenced earlier, calls this liberatory access, in which we address inaccessibility and ableism by building deeper relationships with one another, and then realigning our values in what matters most to us and challenging oppression. So I want to end by encouraging you to think about what that means for you. What does it mean to realign your values to and your relationships to opening up access? Imagine what a commitment to access would mean as a way of living, as a way of being, as a reflection of who you are, as a professional of living out a profession, of permeating all your life and society. I think this is embracing the richness of disability, of which law and policy are only minor points. Y'all have been great, and I'm looking forward to whatever questions you have. Thank you. Yes.
Can you can hear me? Okay, so for today, if you have a question, please write it on one of the note cards that is in one of the cup holders near you. There should be many around you. If there's not one immediately, there might be one a little farther over, or perhaps in front or behind. But write your questions down and raise them up or pass them to the edges so I don't have to climb over folks. And then we will collect these and start asking them over the mics. Thank you. I see some already.
And remember, if any of you see me on an airplane, you're supposed to talk to me and be nice, right? Good.
Okay, so the first question we have is, what can I do as a human, an artist, and or as a neurologically disabled person to reduce stigma?
I think this is both personal and a structural question. One, I think as disabled people, we can be public about it and not ashamed, or at least resist that shame. And talk about how that may influence our art, our daily practices, what we do, what we love, just being public about it. I also think, however, that we need to push at structural change. Y'all, I'm pointing my finger here, need to hold your university accountable, your professors accountable, your families accountable, yourself accountable. I also think it's really important as activists to know that none of us have unending energy and we can't be activists in all ways. And so thinking of the ways which you can be an activist and doing it when you can, and then not kicking yourself when you can't. Because we simply can't do that, all of us ourselves.
Okay. The ADA was passed in 1990. What can we do to secure another significant victory as monumental as the ADA?
Congress has never, ever, ever done anything because they just woke up one morning and said, hey, let's be nice to these people and pass these civil rights laws, okay? Congress has never done that. Any civil rights legislation has only been the result of decades, and I mean decades of activism, pushing and holding political figures accountable for what we want. I also think that the ADA passed in 1990, but by 2000, I may have the year wrong. It had become so weakened by court decisions that Congress actually had to go back and pass, because they're really bad at acronyms, the ADA, the Adjustment Act, to bring back the strength that it had at the beginning. So I think we also need to hold our politicians accountable. I think you can ask your politicians about disability rights issues, disability justice issues, and there are all kinds of those things that you may think about in your own communities. So I think a big way to keep that up is to vote, to ask questions of your politicians, to hold them accountable, to run for office yourself, to think about what you can do if that is an interest of yours, and learn what the issues are in your community and what matter to you. For example, in Ohio, where I live right now, the biggest disability issue has been around child custody. In Ohio, as in half the states in the United States, it is perfectly legal to take away child parental rights and custody because of disability and that reason alone. Now, I'm not arguing that all disabled parents are perfect parents, right? But we need more than that. And I think in Ohio, we've been able to convince the state legislature to remove that as simply disability alone being enough to terminate parental rights. So, ask around and what are the issues that are important in your community, and then vote.
Here's another one. I apologize. Oh, okay. Another one related to ADA. Since the passage of the Americans with Disability Act in 1971, 40 years later, why have housing providers been so reluctant to create housing that is accessible?
Yeah.
What major roadblocks lie ahead?
What housing folks often say is that it's too expensive. However, if they build in accessibility from the very beginning, it's not that much more expensive, and sometimes it's not at all. Also, all of us are aging. I hate to tell you, your parents are getting older, your grandparents are getting older, your aunts and uncles are getting older, you're getting older, I'm getting older, and we need differing spaces that are accessible. So it's actually economically advantageous to housing folks to build accessibility in, because the population that needs it is always here. However, in my county, which I know is not alone in this, housing discrimination, the largest category of housing discrimination complaints is around disability. And that includes, sometimes that includes access issues and accommodations, but also there's a large number of deaf folks in my community that have been denied housing. Now, there's no accessibility thing there that has to be added that's monetary. Many folks with psych disabilities are being denied housing and landlords because of stigma again. So I think activists need to hold housing laws, make sure they're enforced. You can think about your fair housing. Some of you can go into law, some of you can go into justice, you can become policy walks, think about advocacy, access in your profession, but housing is a huge issue. And many people with disabilities still face discrimination in housing markets. And we are told that that's economic, but it is not economics.
Okay, thank you. One more question.
I'm becoming emphatic as the night goes on, aren't I?
Well, you can get really emphatic on this last one. You mentioned that independence is a myth, so is doing disability justice inherently anti-capitalist?
I laugh. There are lots of activists who say yes. Lots of activists who say yes to that. I'm at a point where I'm not sure. Because so much of ableism is actually contrary to economics. I just gave the example about housing, where ableism is trumping economics in that case. In the institutionalization of people with disabilities, ableism is trumping economics. It's economically cheaper for people to be in individualized housing with individualized support structures, and yet we pay more to have people with disabilities segregated away in large-scale institutions. So there are so many examples from US history and from today in which ableism is actually contrary to people's economic advantage and to our advantage as taxpayers. Y'all are helping to pay for this, and you will. I do think, however, that capitalist ideas of productivity can be inherently ableist, right? My employer would really love it if I'd work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it would never complain. And I don't think you'll ever find an employer who will complain if you work, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. They would love that. However, that's not going to be good for you. And so I think there's a ways that US ideals of productivity and always having to do more are inherently tied up into our capitalism, and we need to think about that and challenge that.
All right. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you. Please give us a warm thank you to Dr.
Thank you for
Nielsen.
your question.
We will be hosting a book sale and book signing up in the lobby, and we invite you to join us to get a book and get your book signed. Additionally, we have some folks here that are asking about FSE credit. QR code, the speakers, the QR codes are out in the lobby. So if you have your device that can read QR codes, you should be set. Thank you.
Kathy, don't go around that way. That must be the right direction. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I appreciate that. And considered expendable.
Excuse me.
Pardon me. Hello.
Do you shake?
I do shake.
I'm Scott Loren. I'm the
Nice to
Director of
meet you.
Student Disability Services.
Oh, lovely.
I've been here 24 years. I loved what you had to say about hospitality. I think that's something that in my own personal reflection and growth I thought a lot about. We use a phrase here, campus of care, which is similar. And as I've been looking at kind of going beyond the law to what we can do,
Yeah.
That doesn't cost the university anything, and can fit within the budget and all. I
Yeah.
think, campus of care, hospitality, we did a lot of it through COVID, and I really found faculty to be supportive.
I think we all want to do that. We just don't know how.
Yeah. You're at the University of Toledo.
Mhm.
Is that a Catholic university?
No, it's a public.
Public, okay. Yeah, I was just looking up to see what you guys, what your services were like.
Yeah.
there.
Well, we're in search of a new student
I'm-
disability services coordinator. Ours just left, a very skilled person. So
Yeah, I love what I'm doing here and the people
Well, that's
that I work
great.
with.
yeah,
So-
spread the word.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So, well, good. When did your book first come out?
10 years ago.
10 years ago. Okay. I think I remember reading it back then, but it's been a while. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for coming tonight.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's past my bedtime.
Yeah, I
but that's okay.
understand.
Yeah.
I understand.
But Kim, it was great meeting you.
Thank you.
I'll be out there.
Okay. And I'll follow you wherever I'm supposed to go.
I don't see any. I think somebody did have it.
Oh, like, oh, yeah, controlling. Well, we put them all out, so. Yeah, we have, mine way out. Oh, yeah, that's an idea. That's an idea. That's good. Yeah, but, well, thank you. I'm going to do that. I think next week, you can have. Yeah, that will help. Is our really appreciate our own opportunity to that. Thank you. What do you say? You're welcome. Oh. Yeah. Okay, I mean, I don't know. 98 times. For the last episode. I don't know. So, the very first episode, I don't, no, I don't, I'm not, I don't know. That's not ours. Oh, that paper? Oh, this. Yeah.